Hi, welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. Southern Ontario NDP MP Joe Comartin lost his dad when he was a year old, and his mom showed incredible strength and courage in raising all 8 of her children on her own. Joe Comartin went to law school, became a trial lawyer, and then decided to run for office. He's been an MP since 2000, and he joins me now to talk all about his love for his family, his love for his career, and his life beyond politics. Joe Comartin, welcome to Beyond Politics. It's great to have you here.
Well, it's good to be here.
You have a really interesting story about your young life. You come from a big family, lots of kids.
Right.
How many were you?
There was 8 of us.
And where did you place in the...
I was the second youngest. We kind of joke about this because my father, who died in my first year of life, had conceived 5 girls first. And the joke around was that, until he finally got a son, they were going to keep having children, and he was French Catholic, French Canadian Catholic, and she was Irish Catholic. And there was no birth control at that point of any serious kind. So the joke was that until he had 5 boys to match the 5 girls, he would continue to have children. But he passed away before that happened. But they had 8 children in 10 years.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
How did your mom cope?
She was an amazing woman. I think that's just clear. She had actually been a teacher. She taught for 2 years. She was paid a certain salary in the first year. They cut the salary in half in the second year, and she was laid off in the third year. She started teaching during the Depression. And you talk about fate, coincidence. My father grew up in the West, in Manitoba and North Dakota. He was actually an American because he was born on the U.S. side of the border. But she was living in London, Ontario, and one of her aunts had become quite ill in Detroit. And about the same time she moved there to help take care of my aunt because she didn't have employment, he got a job at Ford's in Detroit. And so they met there within the Irish Catholic community, which was quite sizable in Detroit at the time, met and married, and then moved back to just outside of Windsor on a farm.
Wow. Now, what did your dad die of?
Cancer.
So did they know far in advance that he had cancer, or was it something that was relatively quick?
No, he actually had 2 bouts of it right near the end of the First World War. Not quite that old, although he was older than her. Right near the end of the Second World War, so late 44, early 45, he had his first bout. It was in the stomach area. Actually recovered from that and went back to work. At that point, he had transferred over to Windsor and was working at Ford's in Windsor, as well as running a small farm out in the county, which is where we were living. And then contracted a second bout of it in, I guess would have been in 47, and then died in 48.
That's an unbelievable amount of stress for your mom to endure, both the idea of having 8 children to raise on her own, but also having just lost her own husband. Did she ever talk about it? She
actually didn't talk very much about it. I learned more about it from one of her sisters who was a nurse and had come and helped during the second period of my father's illness, and a period of time just shortly before he died. She spent the summer with us that summer. And so she told me a fair amount about it. And then there was a cousin, would have been my father's first cousin, who lived in the area, and he and his wife told me a fair amount about it. But no, my mother rarely talked much about it, and it was a bit of gender discrimination here because my mother did talk to my sisters a bit more about it.
Right.
But even to them, she was fairly closed on.
What happened to your family?
We continued to live on the farm. You think back on just. It was interesting what happened at that period of time. We were lucky enough to have our mortgage on the farm with a credit union who had just a few years before introduced the concept of mortgage insurance to the country. It was the credit union movement that did that, and so the mortgage got paid off.
Great.
So we were able to stay on the farm. Because I can't imagine us not having ended up being split up if we would have been having to move. Although again, with my mother's strength, maybe she would have figured out a way to do that. So we were able to stay on the farm. we had really good support from the local community. It was amazing. And my mother didn't. We were living in a French Canadian community at that point, and my mother never could learn another language, although she tried several times during her lifetime. But in spite of that, the local community was primarily French speaking. They were very helpful, really supported us, and some of these were blood relatives to my father. My mother's family, who were still mostly in London, a couple of the uncles there were very supportive, regularly attended, I think helped her financially as well during that period of time. But we were on welfare. We were getting some income from the farm, but it was less than a 50-acre farm, so there was not enough income certainly to support a family. And so we were on welfare for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. My younger brother was born. My mother was expecting him when my father died. So when he started grade 1, we didn't have kindergarten at the school, then she went back teaching.
What do you remember from that time period yourself?
I have recognition, cognizance of things from about the time I was 3. I think that's fairly normal for most people. Remember one time my grandmother on my father's side coming, and actually she passed away shortly after that. She and my mother never got along. My mother used to always joke about when we were bad, we were her children, and when we were good, we were my father's children.
I think that's standard.
Well, that was my grandmother's attitude. They never really got along. I remember that visit. She didn't even stay overnight. She just came for a short time. She was living in California at the time. They had my father's wing of the family had moved further west, in spite of him coming back here. I remember it was a good living. Because we were able to grow a lot of our own fruits and vegetables. Our diet was actually quite a healthy diet. We didn't have a lot of chemicals in it. And the farmers around us provided us with meat, and poultry in particular, on a fairly regular basis, either at cost or oftentimes just giving it to us. I remember one of my, he was actually a cousin, but one of my uncles, as we addressed him that way, he cut our hair, cut the boys' hair, and they did those kind of things for us. So it was a very warm, welcoming, supportive community. It's hard to imagine that happening in this day and age, when you're so spread apart, families are so spread apart, but that community really was very, very supportive of us.
It actually sounds like what could have been a very scarring experience instead turned out to be a pretty strong foundation.
Yeah, I mean, we knew we were the poorest people in that community, and we were until my mother went back to teaching, and even for a few years, as she started gaining some wealth and some assets. So I remember having some sense of that. I remember going to school in patched clothes. We rarely had any new clothes. It was all hand-me-downs from other members of the extended family on both sides. And
did other kids make fun of you, or do you have?
I don't remember that. I remember one time one kid saying to me something about, "Oh, your knees are all wet." And it wasn't because they were darker than the rest of my slacks that I was wearing,
patches.
But it was because they were patches that were a different color, a darker color than the rest of it. So I remember that kind of thing, and it wasn't any bullying or teasing of that kind. It was just an observation that he made. And there were a few other times when there were things that they were doing, the rest of the community could do, and we couldn't, simply because we didn't have the financial resources. But I don't remember any offensiveness in it. My mother was certainly looked up to because she was probably amongst the better educated in the community. She didn't teach right in that community. She had to move out of the community to teach because she could only teach in English schools. So she was a bit, we're only talking 10 or 20 miles, but she was out of the community teaching. But she was well respected for the fact that she was, better educated than most of the community was. My sisters all did very well in school, and so we tended to be some of the better students, again, because of the help we got at home.
Was it your mom who was really the force behind higher education for the kids and for her kids?
I often wonder about that. If my father had lived, whether we would have gone on as much as we did. obviously I didn't know my father, so I don't know what he would have been like. He had lived actually a fairly interesting life. He was part of that group during the Depression. He was quite a bit older than her. He's almost 20 years older than her, and so he was born in 1897, I think it was, he had ended up on a motorcycle traveling all over North America, so had lived a nomadic life, done a number of different interesting things in terms of the jobs that he did. Didn't do just farm work. He did a lot of different jobs. So I think he would have had a post-secondary education, particularly, would have had an appeal to him because of what he would have experienced in his own life. But I don't know that. But certainly, yeah, there was no question that we got as much education as we possibly could. Although for my older sisters, as they went through, 3 of my 5 sisters were the lead students in the high school that they went to, were the valedictorians of their class. They were the top students, and only my youngest sister, who's a couple of years older than me, 3 years older than me, she was the first one to go to university. My other 2 sisters both became teachers, but there was just no financial way
for them to
be able to go. This preceded student loans and that kind of programs. My youngest sister was there at the time when those started, as I was the next one to go to university.
When did you decide you wanted to be a lawyer?
I'm quite clear on that. It was during my 16th year of life. Up to that point, I was the chosen one. In the Irish Catholic tradition, you always have a chosen one who goes into the religious life.
Okay. How did you become the chosen one? Were you a particularly devout kid? Or were you just quiet?
I was. I'm not sure actually on that, because certainly my sisters were more devout than I was, during that period of time of growing up. I think it was because I was more intellectually engaged in education than my 2 brothers were, certainly, and I'm not sure. But I was the designated one. In fact, there was some discussion early on as I was leaving elementary school before going into high school as to whether I'd go into a junior seminary, which were quite common at that point. But again, finances were an issue there because you had to at least pay something for that. Oftentimes the local parish assisted, but we would have still had to contribute, and there was no way my mother could have afforded that at that point. But anyway, back to the basic question of when I decided when I decided I wasn't going to be a priest was around my 16th year, and I just started going out with girls in that period of time, and I early on realized that I was never going to be able to live a celibate life, and at that point I said, so what am I going to do?
Right.
And I want to say this, and it may sound a bit arrogant, but by that point, I certainly had it inculcated into me that if you had talent, if you had intelligence, if you had skills, you use those not just for your own benefit, but for your community as a whole. And that was true. She really built that into us. And
Your mom?
My mom did, but it's the Irish Catholic part of it, because I've gone back and looked at sort of the Irish Catholic culture, and it very much, the Kennedys and that kind of thing. That belief was built into us from, I think as soon as we could talk, we were understanding that we had to do that. And to some degree she did that herself, in spite of all the other responsibilities she had for 8 children. She did that, so she was a good model in that regard. So it was not only being a lawyer, but it was going to be a lawyer who used those skills for the betterment of the society.
Where along this line of events did you meet your wife, or your future wife?
Again, I think fate intervenes here, and I've said this to her a number of times when she's complained that I was too active in the community. When I was in grade 11, we always had an awards committee that decided, mostly sports. I guess it was all sports awards. So the top athletes of the in the individual sports that we had at our high school. And normally it was the representative on the student council in grade 12 who did that. My wife's a year older than I am. And so she was in grade 12. She was chosen as the representative, the female representative. The guy who should have been chosen in grade 12 was I'm trying to be diplomatic here, just didn't have the skills.
Okay.
And the president of the student council decided that she would come to me, even though I wasn't elected, and ask me to do that. And I think, okay, so that was a committee that I shouldn't have been on, but it was fate that I was on it because it gave me the opportunity to meet her and for us to have interaction for a number of years. So we didn't start going out at that point. She was going out with somebody else at that stage, and then when they broke up, she actually called me. She was in
kidding.
She was in teachers college, and they broke up about a month or two before her prom or whatever, the graduating dinner that they had. And I tell her she needed somebody.
She called you to fill in.
She called me to fill in.
And it's been...
It was, yeah, we were together ever since.
How long have you been married?
It was 40 years in July.
Isn't that something? Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah. The other remarkable achievement, though, two of my other sisters were married 50 years this past year. We had celebrations for both of them.
It was a celebratory summer.
Yeah, it was. It was very much so.
You, when did you decide that politics was of interest to you too, or was it always?
It would have been about the same time. I was president of my student council when I was in grade 12. I don't know when I could say I really knew that I was going to, around that period of time, as I was finishing high school and going into university. I can remember having discussions with my wife at that stage.
About possibly running?
Yeah, but an understanding, and this came from me rather than from her, really a commitment from me that I wouldn't do that until our children, because we weren't even married at the time we were having this discussion, but we knew we would be having children at some stage, and because I grew up without a father, and I didn't want my children to go through that same experience, and I knew how difficult it had been for my mother, and how difficult it would be for my wife, if I was away as much. I really admire people who are able to do that, but I know the kind of stress it puts on families, and so even at that stage, that early stage, I would have been in my late teens, early 20s. I made that commitment that I wouldn't do that until our youngest child was out of high school around that time.
When you did run, was politics what you were expecting it to be?
I joke a bit. It was more after I got elected. I'd always done organizational work in fact, I started this. One of my sisters was a very close friend of Mark McGuigan, who was a cabinet minister in the Trudeau era, and was actually the dean of the law school. But anyway, she was a close friend of one of his key workers, and became a close friend of his over the years as well. So she had gotten me, I guess I was in my second year of university, she had gotten me involved directly in organizational politics during the 68 campaign. And so I've always been involved in an organizational way from that time on. And so I understood what it was like to run for office. And then during the period of time when Dave Cook, who was a cabinet minister in the Ray era in Ontario, close friend, and Stephen Langdon and Howard McCurdy, I worked closely with them and their staff. So I really knew what it was like to be a member of Parliament. And I say there's only two things that have, I guess, caught me a bit off guard and surprised me. One is the need to have to stop at Pearson on the way to Ottawa and back. I regularly, about once a month, have to spend the night in Toronto because of the flight cancellation. But that time amount that I spend is more than I had anticipated having to, because at one time we had direct flights between Windsor and Ottawa. So that was a bit of a surprise.
An unpleasant one.
And an unpleasant one. And the other one is my inability to read as much as I want to.
Oh, really? Because I hear you read a lot.
I do. Again, I say this without any particular arrogance. This is just an objective analysis of my other colleagues. I probably read as much as anybody does, and more than most. Part of that's just the skills that you learn particularly as a trial lawyer. You have to learn how to assimilate information very rapidly, because as much as you prepare for a trial, and I pride myself on preparing for trials, even lengthy ones, there's always stuff that catches you off guard in the midst of the trial, and anybody who's done trial work knows that. And so you have to be able to assimilate information very rapidly. You have to be able to read fast and assimilate it quickly. So I have that talent, or maybe skill more so, that you just develop as a trial lawyer. So I have the ability to do it, but I would say in terms of what I really would like to read, I'd like to be able to read about twice what I do.
What do you want to read?
I want to read material that prepares me for the committee hearings.
So you don't want to read a nice book. You don't want to be able to relax and read a nice book.
I do that. It's probably my, other than the time I spend with my wife, it's probably the single biggest relaxation that I have.
Even if it's committee work?
No, I'm talking about the novels.
Okay, good.
I read a lot of historical novels, and that's one of the ways I have of breaking away from the pressure and stress of the job.
I hear you're a workaholic.
No, I've had staff accuse me of that, and I've always been offended by that.
Have you been?
I have, because I don't.
Here's your opportunity.
I don't think I am, because I think a workaholic, and I say this from. I did, I think, probably 2,000-3,000 marriage separations, and because I did a lot of matrimonial work at one period of time in my career, and a number of those were because of usually the male partner being a workaholic, and so my definition of workaholic is someone who is compelled to do work at the expense of their personal lives and their family lives, and I think I'm fair in saying this. I have not done that. My family is clearly my priority, always has been. And I've become a grandfather in the last couple of years, and that continues on. We're very conscious about the amount of time we get to spend with our grandkids.
How has your political career impacted the amount of time you can spend with your family?
It hasn't been, again, because I didn't, the work that I was doing as a lawyer certainly took up long hours. But, I coached my boys' teams. They both were soccer players, and my daughter actually was a long-distance runner, and we spent a lot of time with her. She was one of the best long-distance runners in her period of time in the under 19. She actually competed for Canada internationally in 1 year, and won the gold medal in Ontario for long-distance running. So we were actively engaged in that, both my wife and I. Certainly I was there when they, around the school, including when they had problems at school, but their events. So I always made time for that, generally speaking. I worked long hours as a lawyer, and the community work that I did, back to that Irish Catholic upbringing, that commitment that you've got to give back. So there were a lot of time spent, but we scheduled our lives so that I was home for dinner. I rarely missed dinner. In fact, even I had a branch office out in the. I was practicing in Windsor, but I had a branch office out in Bell River, which is about 20 miles from Windsor. Both my parents and my stepfather and my mother were living there at the time, and my in-laws were living there. So my wife would come out with the children and would have dinner together at one of the family homes. So even during that period of time, we tried to always have dinner together. I would usually be there in the morning when they got up. So we, in those early years, in particular, we were doing, when they get into their teens, they don't want to spend time with us anyway. So, but then I think we stayed actively engaged. So that was the pattern, when I was, both in terms of the organizational work I was doing for political parties, and the legal work that I was doing. By the time I got elected, they were all graduated from university and on their own.
What do you do now when you have time with your wife? If you're not reading a book.
Yeah, that was one of the things my kids used to accuse me of, was when I did ignore them, was when I was reading newspapers. My oldest boy, in fact, when he was about 2 or 3, he'd get frustrated if I was reading. He wanted to play, so he'd just dive through the newspaper. I did that a number of times. I got the message. But with my wife, we try to get out of Windsor if we're going to be able to spend at least a day or more together.
Uninterrupted.
Uninterrupted. Well, we learned early on, even when I was practicing law, that a couple of times we rented cottages on Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair, and I just would constantly be running into clients and stuff. So you really can't break away. So we need to get out of the county. We'll try to get away. One of our favorite areas is to go to Niagara on the Lake, both because of the wineries and because of the festival. And we just really like the community. We'll go to Stratford usually once a year as well to do that. We skied for a number of years, so we stopped doing that. But when we're home and we're staying home, we try to stay at home. We try to stay in the house and just have dinner together.
Do you have any hobbies?
No, I don't. Reading is the only other pleasure I have. I'd say for a good number of years as the kids were growing up, we downhill skied. So that was the only sport that I was actively involved in. I was riding a bicycle at one point, but I haven't even done that for a couple of years. My garage got broken into. My bike got stolen. Actually, I got it back after about a year. Police found it.
Really?
Yeah, he was using it to commit other robberies.
No.
And they caught him one time. So, he had messed it up pretty badly. And although I've had it tuned a couple of times.
So that's your excuse for not having to bike ride anymore?
Well, I got to have some excuse. And that's
that's
although
a good
my son points out to me that a bike that he had taken from me to Toronto, and he gave back to me that I had a backup, but I just
forgot about it.
It's just time. We have a great route along the riverfront in Windsor. We've converted all of our railroad tracks that were the riverfront to passive parks, and it's really quite nice. We have a sculpture garden in there, so riding the bike along there is a real pleasure.
Do you anticipate wanting to continue doing this work for as long as you can? Or?
Well, I claim that my political enemies are spreading rumors that I'm going to retire soon. I'll be 62 in December, but what I said at my nomination meeting in September was, and what I've said to my wife is that as long as my health is okay and my energy levels are there, I'd stand for office. The electorate then deciding whether they still want me. But have I set a maximum end to it? I have. And at one time I thought probably around 65. But and I say
that could be 4 more elections in this climate.
Exactly. She points that out to me as well. We've been through so many of them. I guess the real problem is that almost on a philosophical basis, I come out of a strong trade union history, and the mandatory retirement of 65 has been pretty much grilled into me. But my health is fine. I do carry an extremely heavy workload, mostly because the Conservatives insist on continuing with all these crime bills. So I've got a really heavy workload, and I'm able to keep up with it. I think my workload is as heavy as any members of my caucus, almost all of them whom are younger than I am. And so I'm able to do it, and I guess as long as I can do it, I will continue.
Well, I wish you much continued good health and success. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome.